Hello and welcome to Sleeper Historian. Imagine a city so vast, so dazzling, that travelers compared it to a dream. It's Tenochtitlan, the jewel of the Aztec world, built on water, alive with markets, temples, and causeways that stretched toward the horizon. To be lost here was to be overwhelmed by sound, color, and ritual unlike anything you'd ever known. The world is vibrant, ordered, and yet, to an outsider, impossibly confusing. A maze of canals and streets where every turn could lead you deeper into wonder or danger. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Let the hum of the night carry you. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and drift into a city on the water. A place where the gods towered over you, the markets never seemed to end, and getting lost was part of the experience. Congratulations, you've just stepped into Tenochtitlan, and you may never find your way out. The city revealed itself like a dream pulled from water, shimmering and alive, more improbable with every step. To anyone approaching Tenochtitlan for the first time, the thought always came unbidden, surely this wasn't real. Surely it was a trick of the lake, some floating mirage that would vanish if you blinked too hard. But it was real. The causeways stretched like veins across the water, wide stone arms carrying traders, pilgrims, and the hopelessly lost into the very heart of the Mexica world. And among the countless footsteps echoing against the slabs of volcanic stone, there walked a stranger, bewildered, dazzled, and utterly unprepared for the maze ahead. The stranger had expected noise, but not this kind of noise. It wasn't the dull roar of a medieval market, nor the grumble of wooden cart wheels on cobbled streets. This was sharper, cleaner, somehow more alive. The slap of sandal against stone, the rush of reed canoes brushing the water's edge, the hum of voices carrying strange cadences that seemed to bounce off the stucco walls. And then there were the smells. Corn roasted on flat stones, cacao rich and bitter, sweat heavy in the midday heat, and the unmistakable tang of lake water thick with lilies. It was intoxicating and a little overwhelming, rather like walking into a crowded subway station at rush hour and realizing you've just stepped into the wrong city entirely. The stranger's first mistake was pausing. One did not simply pause in the middle of a Tenochtitlan causeway, any more than one might stand still in the middle of a New York crosswalk and hope for the best. Within moments, a porter carrying a woven frame stacked higher than his head gave a sharp grunt and swerved just in time, the weight wobbling dangerously. A woman carrying clay jugs muttered something under her breath, probably not a compliment, and a barefoot child darted past, balancing a tray of bright red chilies with the kind of grace that made the stranger feel clumsy just for existing. The lesson was clear: keep moving or be trampled. The city did not wait for stragglers. It swallowed them whole, and so swept along with the current of humanity. The stranger entered through the great causeway into the city proper, eyes wide, heart racing. Imagine, if you will, stumbling into Times Square for the first time. But instead of neon lights, you're greeted by towering pyramids painted in dazzling hues, their staircases alive with chanting priests and endless processions. Instead of honking horns, you hear conch shells, bone flutes, and the rhythmic beat of drums that seem to vibrate in your very chest. Instead of digital billboards advertising soda, there are painted murals of gods with wide, unblinking eyes who look at you as if they know exactly how long you're going to last here. And the odds aren't great. The stranger did not so much walk into Tenochtitlan as tumble into it. The city had a way of pulling you forward, as though every street was designed to funnel you deeper, to keep you from retracing your steps. The wide avenues branched into narrower lanes, each lined with whitewashed houses of adobe and stone, their flat roofs dusted with drying maize or chilies, strung up like jewels in the sun. Water glimmered everywhere. Canals sliced through the neighborhoods like veins, and from their edges jutted wooden piers where canoes were moored, their hulls heavy with baskets of fish, beans, and obsidian blades. The air smelled like roasted maize, lake water, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Not enough to alarm, but enough to remind anyone paying attention that this was a city where gods demanded more than polite worship. The stranger stopped again, couldn't help it this time, and found themselves staring at a procession. It was unlike anything seen in the markets of Florence, the bazaars of Cairo, or even the grand parades of Rome. Here came dancers cloaked in feathers so brilliant they caught the light like shards of stained glass. They moved in perfect rhythm, their sandals slapping against the stones, their arms painted in spirals of red and black. Behind them, drummers struck stretched hides with carved sticks, and the deep thud echoed across the plaza, steady and inevitable as a heartbeat. And then, the priests. Robed in white, they carried incense burners that belched sweet, choking smoke. The scent was unfamiliar, resinous, sticky, and heavy, clinging to the throat. Copal, the stranger realized. The very air seemed to waver with it. A boy beside the stranger whispered something excitedly, tugging at his mother's sleeve, pointing at the procession. His mother hushed him, but even she craned her neck to watch. The stranger could see why. There was a majesty to it, yes, but also a faint unease. The priests' faces were calm, serene even, but their hands bore the stains of something darker than paint. For a moment the stranger wondered whether the same conch shell horns that welcomed the dawn might later echo in sacrifice. But perhaps that was the trick of the place. Everything here was doubled. Beauty with terror, life with death, celebration with sacrifice. A city suspended not just on a lake, but on a razor's edge. And speaking of edges, the stranger nearly toppled into a canal, trying to get out of the way of a canoe poling past. The boatman shot them a look that required no translation, something between irritation and amusement. The same kind of look New Yorkers give tourists blocking the subway doors to take a selfie. The stranger murmured an apology in a language nobody here spoke, and shuffled quickly onto the bridge, cheeks burning. Bridges, canals, markets, pyramids. The city was too much, too alive, too immediate. There was no single way to take it in. Every corner revealed something else. Women grinding maize on stone slabs, the rhythm of stone on stone echoing like music. Children playing with small balls of rubber, shrieking when one bounced into the canal and floated away. Men carrying obsidian knives with hilts carved into snarling jaguar heads. The stranger longed to stop, to absorb each detail like paint on canvas, but the current of people would not allow it. Somehow, they ended up in the market. If the causeways had been overwhelming, the market was downright dizzying. Imagine walking into the largest shopping mall you've ever seen, and then multiply it by 10, and remove the air conditioning, and add several thousand traders, each with something louder to sell than the last. That was Tlatelolco Market, the beating heart of the empire. Rows upon rows of stalls stretched into the distance, shaded by woven mats. The goods were as varied as they were astonishing. Heaps of maize cobs piled like golden treasure. Guards filled with chocolate paste ready to be whipped into a drink. Woven cloths dyed in indigos and reds, so deep they seemed impossible without chemical factories. There were cages of turkeys that gobbled indignantly at anyone who came too close. Piles of dried chili peppers that made the air sting with their heat. And pyramids of salt gleaming white under the sun. But it wasn't just food or cloth. Oh no! The stranger quickly realized this was not a market in the European sense. It was a universe. Here were vendors selling obsidian knives sharper than steel. There were a row of herbalists hawking powders and ointments for every conceivable ailment. Need to cure a fever. Done. Want to guarantee the love of a certain someone. Step right this way, my friend. Want to make your enemy break out in unsightly boils. Not a problem. There's a powder for that too. The stranger couldn't help thinking that Amazon Prime had nothing on this. The only thing missing was next day delivery. But considering you could probably hire a porter to sprint the goods across town, even that was covered. Of course, The sounds of the market were half the experience. Sellers shouted, barked, sang their wares, each voice layering upon the next, until the stranger thought the air itself might collapse under the noise. A man in front demonstrated a blowgun, sending a dart into a bundle of reeds with such accuracy that a small crowd gasped. A woman scooped ground maize into a customer's basket, her bracelets jangling as she moved. Somewhere, a group of musicians struck up a tune with flutes and rattles, their melody swallowed by the chaos but persistent nonetheless. The stranger stopped by a stall selling cacao beans, marveling at the neat piles of what looked like nothing more than brown seeds. But here, in this city, they were money. Literal money. The seller raised an eyebrow as the stranger bent too close, as if to say, "Look, but don't pretend you can afford anything." And fair enough, the stranger had no idea how many beans it might cost to buy even a piece of fruit. One thing was certain: there would be no credit card swiped here, no PayPal, no tap to pay. Just the rattle of cacao beans in a pouch. The stranger straightened quickly, hands behind their back, and shuffled away like a window shopper who had wandered into Prada by mistake. The day pressed on, and the stranger began to realize something important. They were very, very lost. Not just wrong street. Lost. Not Google Maps is lagging. Lost. But properly, terrifyingly, stomach-droppingly lost. The kind of lost that leaves you staring at 1,000 strangers' faces and realizing not one of them can tell you how to get home. Not least because you don't even know where home is. Every canal looked like the last. Every street blurred into another. Every pyramid loomed too tall to use as a landmark. Tenochtitlan wasn't a city built for newcomers. It was a labyrinth disguised as a paradise. The stranger ducked into a quieter alley, or at least quieter by local standards, and leaned against a wall painted with faded red glyphs. Their heart pounded, partly from exhaustion, partly from fear. They were alone. Utterly alone in a city where the gods smiled at sacrifice, and strangers vanished into the lake without so much as a ripple. And then came the laughter. Not cruel laughter, not mocking exactly, but sharp enough to sting. A group of children had spotted the stranger, their faces alight with mischief. They pointed, whispered, and broke into giggles. The stranger glanced down at themselves, suddenly aware of every odd detail: the foreign clothes, the pale skin, the awkward way of standing. To these children, they must have looked ridiculous. One of the braver ones stepped forward and asked something in Nahawal. The words meant nothing to the stranger, but the tone was unmistakable. "Who are you? And why do you look like you've wandered out of the wrong story?" The stranger tried to respond. Something polite, something universal. A smile, perhaps, a hand raised in greeting. But the words stuck in their throat. The children laughed harder, scattering like sparrows before a stone. And suddenly, the stranger understood. In Tenochtitlan, you didn't need enemies to feel small. The city itself did the work for you. The sun had shifted, tilting just enough to paint the canals in streaks of gold. Shadows stretched long, and the noise of the market swelled rather than softened. If the stranger had hoped for evening calm, they were sorely mistaken. This was the hour when the city flexed its muscles, when everyone who had delayed errands spilled into the streets at once. Canoes bumped shoulders on the canals, porters jogged with fresh loads. And somewhere in the distance the faint echo of drums signaled a ritual unfolding on the steps of a temple. The stranger tried to follow the current of the crowd, hoping it might eventually carry them somewhere recognizable. Instead, it only drove them deeper into the labyrinth. Each corner twisted unexpectedly. Each alley that seemed like an escape only delivered another dizzying stretch of walls painted with glyphs, or hung with drying maize. It was as if the city had conspired to confuse them, a grand joke whispered by its stone foundations. Their stomach growled. Hunger had a way of making confusion worse, and the smells around them didn't help. Someone roasted squash seeds on a flat stone, the nutty aroma wafting through the air. Another stall fried maize dough, patting the discs thin before laying them on a clay griddle until the edges crisp. The stranger's mouth watered at the scent of chili sauce ladled over roasted fish. Though a sudden waft of pulque, a sour, yeasty smell, reminded them that not every delicacy here would sit well with an outsider's stomach. It was one thing to admire the food from afar, it was another to imagine your insides staging a rebellion halfway through the meal. A group of women sat nearby, grinding maize with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The sound of stone against stone was strangely soothing, like the hum of an old washing machine back home, the kind that rattled the floor, but lulled you anyway. They chatted softly between grinding, laughing at jokes the stranger couldn't understand, though the warmth of their smiles was universal. For a brief moment, it was tempting to sit down beside them, to join the rhythm, to pretend that getting lost was just another way of finding yourself. But one glance at their painted faces and the vivid scarlet cloth draped across their shoulders reminded the stranger that they belonged here, while he most certainly did not, so they kept walking. And the city, in its own mischievous way, offered up more curiosities. A man passed with a cage of brightly feathered birds, their cries sharp enough to pierce the den. Children played a game with a rubber ball, bouncing it off their hips with startling agility, their laughter bubbling into the air. A pair of nobles strutted by, cloaked in fabrics so fine they glistened, their servants trailing behind with fans of woven palm leaves. The stranger tried not to stare but failed miserably. Subtlety was difficult when everything screamed of wealth, status, and power. The nobles, predictably, noticed. One of them glanced sideways, lips curling in the faintest smirk. It was the kind of look that said, "Yes, we know we're better dressed than you, and yes, we enjoy your astonishment." The stranger looked away, cheeks burning, suddenly aware of how plain and foreign they must seem. It was like wandering into a fashion runway in your sweatpants, clutching a half-empty coffee cup. Still, awe outweighed embarrassment. Because just when the stranger thought they had seen it all, the market, the nobles, the dancers, the city revealed its centerpiece. The plaza opened like a stage curtain, revealing the great Templo Mayor. It towered above the city, twin staircases rising steep and proud, painted in brilliant red and blue. The temples at the summit gleamed in the late sun, their walls bearing the marks of countless rituals. Smoke curled lazily upward from braziers, staining the sky in shades of grey. Drums thudded from somewhere unseen, low and steady, each beat a reminder of the god's hunger. The stranger froze. For all the grandeur of palaces or the bustle of markets, this was different. This was not for human eyes, it was for the divine. And yet here it stood, unflinching, daring anyone to look away. The crowd thinned slightly near the base of the temple, as though instinctively giving space. The stranger edged closer, feet dragging, curiosity warring with dread. Up close, the stone smelled faintly of something metallic, sharp and unpleasantly familiar. Blood had a way of marking itself in stone, no matter how often it was washed away. The stranger's throat tightened. They knew, with sudden clarity, that this was not just a city of trade and laughter and music. It was also a city of sacrifice, where the gods demanded their due and mortals supplied it willingly. And yet, life swirled on. A vendor nearby sold tamales wrapped in green leaves, shouting over the drums. Children darted underfoot. Lovers whispered at the edge of the plaza. It was jarring, this coexistence of the ordinary and the sacred, as if Times Square were built in the shadow of an altar still slick with blood. The stranger lingered too long. A priest descending the temple steps caught their gaze, eyes dark and unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, didn't move beyond that steady stare, but it was enough. The stranger felt their skin prickle, a rush of heat in their chest. The stare said, "You don't belong." And worse, it said, "The gods will notice." Heart hammering, the stranger turned sharply away, nearly colliding with a group of porters carrying baskets of maize. They muttered irritably, shoving past, and the moment was gone. The priest had vanished back into the crowd, or perhaps into the temple itself. But the weight of his gaze lingered, heavy as a stone tied to the chest. The stranger did not know it yet, But this was only the beginning of being lost, not just in streets and canals, but in something much larger. And if the city's markets had overwhelmed, and its temples unsettled, what came next would press harder still. Because Tenochtitlan had another side, one that thrived after sunset. Night in Tenochtitlan was not silence, it was transformation. The sun slid behind the mountains, and the city shifted its rhythm. The market stalls closed one by one, mats rolled, baskets stacked, voices fading into the distance. Canoes still glided across the canals, but their loads were lighter now. Firewood, herbs, the last of the fish caught that day. Smoke curled upward from hearths, carrying with it the scent of masa cooking, beans simmering, chili sauce thickening over clay pots. It was dinner time, and the city smelled like it. The stranger's stomach twisted, hunger gnawing insistently. But more than that, unease crept in with the fading light. The laughter of the market was replaced with a different sound, the clatter of guards' sandals on stone, the echo of conch shells signalling the hours, the occasional bark of a dog left untied in the alleys. The air cooled, the lake breezes slipping between the houses, and with them came the awareness that this was a city surrounded by water. No escape into the hills, no path into the forests. Just causeways stretching thin and narrow, watched at both ends. The stranger wandered deeper, drawn by firelight flickering at the end of a canal. It was not a temple, nor a noble's palace, but a common courtyard where families gathered. Clay torches flickered, throwing shadows across the plastered walls. A woman knelt by a fire, turning maize cakes with practiced hands, while children darted around her like fireflies. Men sat cross-legged, drinking pulque from gourd cups, their laughter booming and rough. It should have been comforting, the kind of scene that warmed the bones. But for the stranger it was a reminder everyone belonged here except them. They hovered at the edge like a ghost, invisible but not unseen. Heads turned occasionally, eyes flicking toward the outsider, curiosity tempered by caution. The stranger smiled weakly, raised a hand in a gesture they hoped translated into harmlessness, then moved on before questions followed. The canals by night were beautiful. In that eerie way beauty sometimes unsettles. Moonlight painted the water silver, reflecting the reed canoes moored at their edges. Crickets sang. The occasional splash echoed. A fish leaping, or perhaps something larger. Torches burned at the bridges, their flames licking the night air. Smoke trailing upward. Shadows of men with spears stood at the crossings, guards ensuring no one slipped in or out unnoticed. The stranger realized with a jolt that being lost here was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Still, curiosity tugged harder than fear. The city had not finished revealing itself. Somewhere ahead came the sound of flutes, soft, mournful, winding through the air like smoke. The stranger followed, footsteps careful, until they came upon another plaza, smaller than the great market but alive with people nonetheless. Here the atmosphere was different. Less trade, more performance. A circle had formed around dancers painted in jaguar skins, their bodies rippling as they moved to the beat of drums. Feathered headdresses bobbed, obsidian blades flashed in torchlight, and the rhythm built until the stranger's own heartbeat tried to match it. The crowd roared approval, clapping, stamping. A man nearby shouted something that drew laughter, the kind of bawdy joke that needed no translation. Even here, even now, humor threaded through the night. The stranger smiled despite themselves, thinking how little had changed across centuries. Humans everywhere gathered around music and laughter, whether under neon lights or beneath the moon on a lake. But then came the turn. A second group entered the circle, this one painted in stark white, faces masked with skulls. Their dance was slower, deliberate, a mocking shadow of the jaguar's energy. The crowd hushed, then erupted into chants. The stranger's stomach tightened. This was no ordinary performance. It was ritual, a reenactment, perhaps of gods and mortals, life and death. The lines blurred in the torchlight until the dancers seemed more than human, their shadows stretching into something older, darker. The stranger stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they stood, how visible they were. One of the skull-faced dancers turned, eyes catching theirs through the mask. Just for an instant. But it was enough to send a chill crawling up the spine. The music swelled. The stranger retreated. They slipped down a side alley, breath quick, ears still ringing with drum beats. The city pressed closer here. Walls narrow, shadows thicker. A dog growled somewhere in the dark, teeth flashing before it darted away. The stranger quickened their pace, sandals slapping against stone. They had no idea where they were headed, only that forward felt safer than standing still. And then the smell hit. Not food, not incense, not the earthy scent of maize or the sweetness of copal. This was different. Metallic. Heavy. Wrong. The alley opened into a smaller courtyard. Torchlight flickering against stone. At its center lay an altar, low and rough, its surface stained darker than shadow. A priest bent over it, his face hidden, his hands moving with practiced ease. The stranger froze, heart pounding, every instinct screaming to turn back. But the sound came before they could move, the soft thud of a body being lowered, the whisper of cloth sliding against stone, the faint, wet scrape of a blade. The stranger clapped a hand to their mouth. It wasn't spectacle here, not the grand performance of the Templo Mayor, not the drums and conch shells. It was quieter, more intimate, and somehow infinitely worse. The gods were fed in small courtyards as well as great temples, and the stranger had wandered into one. The priest straightened, his gaze swept the shadows. The stranger bolted. Feet pounded against stone, lungs burned, the city spinning around them. They didn't know where they were going, only that distance mattered. Alley after alley, bridge after bridge, until the smell of blood faded, replaced by the more familiar mix of maize, smoke and water. Finally, they collapsed against a wall, chest heaving, ears ringing with the thrum of their own heartbeat. Tenochtitlan had revealed itself, and it was not the dream the lake had promised. It was brilliance and terror, laughter and sacrifice, life and death stitched so tightly together you could not peel them apart. And the stranger, lost and stumbling, had seen just enough to know that being found might be worse. For if the night showed this much, imagine what the dawn would bring. The city was beginning to dim, not in darkness, but in a kind of golden haze as the sun dropped low. Shadows stretched like long fingers across the causeways, and the air seemed to hum with a new energy. Market stalls began closing, the chatter thinning, yet the city did not quiet. It simply shifted, preparing for another rhythm. Somewhere, a drumbeat carried faintly across the water, steady and deep, like the slow heartbeat of Tenochtitlan itself. The stranger paused on a narrow street, watching a family carry baskets into their home, the smell of roasted maize following them through the doorway. Children darted past, laughing, their bare feet slapping against the stone. Life here did not pause, it only transformed. And yet, even in that warmth, something darker lingered in the air. At the end of the street, a temple loomed, its steps climbing toward the sky like a challenge. Torches flickered along its edges, shadows dancing, and in the distance, faint cries rose. Whether celebration, prayer, or something more unsettling, it was impossible to say. The stranger stood still, goosebumps tracing their arms, aware for the first time that being lost in Tenochtitlan was not only about the streets, but about stepping into a world where every corner hid both beauty and dread. The wind shifted, carrying the coppery tang of blood mixed with incense. It clung to the senses, unshakable, and the stranger's stomach twisted. People around them did not flinch. To them, this was normal, the pulse of empire, the smell of devotion. The stranger took one last look at the fading light, feeling the city grow stranger with each breath. Somewhere deep within, curiosity and unease twined together like twin serpents. If the streets and markets held this much wonder, what waited on the temple steps, where drums called louder with every heartbeat? That answer would come soon enough. The drums grew louder as the stranger followed the narrow streets that bent and twisted like the coils of a serpent. Each step forward brought a shift in the air. The market's chatter had faded entirely now, replaced by a rhythm that seemed to vibrate inside the bones. The torches along the avenue burned higher as twilight deepened, their smoke mixing with the sweet resin of copal incense that drifted from unseen braziers. Shadows moved across the walls, not quite solid, as if the city itself were alive, breathing through stone and fire. At the edge of a wide plaza, the stranger stopped short. The space opened suddenly, massive, far larger than any court or square they had known before. This was no marketplace, it was a stage, and the pyramid, temple at its center, dominated all. Its twin staircases rose steeply toward the heavens, flanked by flickering torchlight. At the summit, flames licked skyward, and silhouettes moved in precise, ritual patterns. The crowd gathering below murmured in low tones, not chaotic, not restless, orderly, as if every person here knew their place in the spectacle about to unfold. The stranger pressed themselves against the edge of the plaza, trying to blend in with the groups flowing toward the steps. Families came with baskets of offerings, flowers, food, small carved idols gleaming in the firelight. Warriors in feathered cloaks walked in proud strides, their obsidian blades catching what little light remained. Priests in long dark robes passed silently, faces painted in stark white and black patterns that turned their eyes into empty voids. The stranger's breath hitched, realizing that these weren't costumes, not performances for entertainment. This was life, devotion, duty, and perhaps something far more terrifying. It was not hard to notice how the crowd parted as prisoners were led forward, ropes around their wrists, their faces pale even in the dim glow. Some were silent, their eyes fixed upward at the flames above. Others trembled openly, legs weak as they were pulled toward the steps. The stranger felt an urge to turn away, to slip into the shadows and vanish. But something rooted them there, a dreadful curiosity that prickled the skin. If the market had revealed the city's warmth, this plaza revealed its heart, beating fiercely but with blood. And as the drums quickened, echoing off the walls like thunder rolling over water, the stranger knew they had stumbled into a moment that the city itself demanded to be witnessed. The drums shifted again, no longer steady but urgent, as if the city had drawn a sudden breath. Torches along the plaza flared brighter, their flames snapping in the wind. High above, a priest raised his arms, his silhouette vast against the fire. The crowd responded with a roar that rattled the very stones underfoot. The stranger flinched, the sound not angry but exultant, like a tide crashing against a shore. The prisoners were driven upward, step by step, their thin sandals slapping against the stone. The climb itself seemed endless, cruelly steep, as though designed to strip the strength from already weakened bodies. Some stumbled, yanked upright by the ropes, their faces grey with dread. At the summit, more figures waited, priests masked in feathers, their obsidian knives glinting even in the dimming light. The stranger's stomach turned, and yet their eyes refused to close. A hush fell. The first man was forced onto the flat stone altar. The drums stilled for a heartbeat, the silence vast enough to swallow the plaza whole. Then a single conch shell blew, its mournful wail splitting the air. The knife rose. The crowd leaned forward, and with one swift, practiced motion it was done. The roar that followed was not shock, it was triumph. The stranger's breath came shallow, their chest tight. The firelight painted every face in gold and crimson, the crowd's eyes shining not with cruelty, but with conviction. To them this was no horror, but necessity, a gift to the gods who held their world aloft. And in that moment, the stranger felt very small, an outsider who had stumbled into a universe with rules far different than their own. Yet beneath the revulsion, another thought crept in. This was not only about death, it was about power. Every drumbeat, every flame, every cry reinforced a truth: the empire was unshakable, because its people believed with their whole being. And belief, the stranger realized, could build cities as easily as it demanded blood. As the body was lifted and the ritual continued, the stranger turned slightly, catching sight of something strange at the edge of the plaza. A smaller procession, quieter, slipping away into a narrow side street. They carried no torches, but their pace was urgent, almost secretive. For the first time since entering the square, the stranger felt a different pull. Not toward the towering spectacle, but toward the shadows that seemed to promise another kind of truth. If the temple steps revealed the empire's heart, what secrets might be waiting in the alleys that no crowd dared to follow? That was where the night seemed ready to lead. The stranger slipped away from the plaza before the second cry of the conch shell pierced the night. The roar of the crowd remained behind, echoing through the temple walls, but each step into the side street muffled it, as if the city itself was swallowing the sound to keep its secrets. The narrow passage smelled different here, less incense and torch smoke, more damp stone, rotting maize husks, and the faint musk of animals. The air was cooler too, drawn off the canals that cut through the city like dark ribbons. The stranger kept to the shadows, trailing the small group they had glimpsed. The procession carried no torches, but the faint glow of the moon on the water ahead revealed their forms. Cloaked figures moved swiftly, heads bent, whispering in low voices. One carried a bundle, wrapped tightly in woven cloth, shifting now and then as if whatever lay inside wasn't entirely still. The stranger's breath caught. Was it a prisoner, a child, or simply food meant for the gods of another temple? The thought twisted uneasily in their stomach. As the group reached the edge of a canal, a canoe emerged from the shadows, its hull slim and long, designed to glide silently across the water. Without hesitation, the cloaked figures climbed in, their bundle carefully set in the center. The stranger ducked low behind a stone wall, peering over just in time to see the paddles dip into the water with barely a splash. The canoe began to glide, its passengers vanishing into the dark silver sheen of the canal, their whispers carried off by the night breeze. The stranger lingered there, torn. To follow meant stepping into waters both literal and metaphorical, uncharted, dangerous, and filled with more questions than answers. Yet something in their chest urged them forward, a compulsion as relentless as the beating of those drums back at the plaza. They scanned the banks until their eyes fell on another canoe, smaller, tethered to a post, half filled with baskets of chilies and beans. The owner was nowhere in sight. The stranger hesitated only a moment before sliding into it, the wood creaking softly beneath their weight. The paddle was heavier than it looked. Each stroke pulled the canoe awkwardly, the stranger's arms unused to the motion, the craft wobbling dangerously until it found its rhythm. The pursuit was clumsy, but the dark swallowed sound quickly. And soon the stranger was gliding after the procession, the city's vast waterways opening before them. The canals of Tenochtitlan at night were nothing like the bustling arteries they had been during the day. Now they were solemn, reflective mirrors of the torchlight scattered on balconies above. Houses leaned over the water, their reed roofs whispering against the wind, while small gardens on floating chinampas drifted quietly, their rows of maize and flowers looking ghostly in the moonlight. Frogs croaked in rhythmic bursts, and somewhere far off, the cry of a night bird echoed, a sound lonely enough to make the stranger's skin prickle. And then there were the smells. Even here, away from the plaza, the city's essence clung to the air, roasted maize cooling on household hearths, the wet sweetness of lake plants, and the sour tang of fermenting pulque that drifted faintly from taverns tucked along the shore. It was an orchestra of scents, both comforting and unsettling. The stranger thought briefly of home, of supermarkets with their antiseptic smell of waxed floors and fluorescent lighting, and couldn't help but smirk. Imagine trying to explain for canned soups to someone whose whole pantry floated on a garden in the lake. The pursuit stretched on. The cloaked canoe moved quickly, confident in its course, turning at intersections without hesitation. The stranger struggled to keep pace, often overshooting a turn or scraping along the side of the canal wall. But luck, or perhaps fate, kept them close enough to follow. Eventually, the lead canoe pulled up beside a low structure half, hidden by hanging mats of reeds. It looked nothing like the grand temples or wide plazas, more like a forgotten warehouse or shrine tucked into the city's veins. The figures disembarked swiftly, lifting their bundle with careful hands. They vanished into the structure without a word, leaving the canoe to drift lightly against the shore. The stranger's pulse quickened. This was not for the public eye. Whatever took place here was meant to be unseen. Sliding from their own canoe, the stranger crept along the bank, keeping low until they reached the building's edge. The mats covering its doorway stirred gently in the wind, but no guards stood outside. With breath held tight, the stranger pressed against the wall and peered through a gap between the reeds. Inside, dim firelight revealed a chamber thick with smoke. Figures knelt in a circle, their cloaks spread around them like dark petals. The bundle had been placed in the center, and slowly, reverently, they began unwrapping it. First a layer of woven cloth, then another of animal hide, until finally the shape within was revealed, not a prisoner, not food, but a skull. The stranger's breath caught sharply. The skull was polished, gleaming pale in the flicker of the flames. Feathers sprouted from its crown, painted turquoise and red, while beads of jade dangled from drilled holes along the jaw. It was no ordinary relic. It had been transformed into something sacred, or perhaps cursed. The cloaked figures began to chant, low and rhythmic, their words slipping between syllables the stranger could not fully understand. But the tone was clear: reverence, fear, power. The air inside thickened, as though the skull itself drew the firelight inward. One of the cloaked priests raised it high, the flames painting hollow eyes that seemed, for the briefest moment, to blink. The circle bowed as one, and the chant rose higher, echoing against the reed walls until even the stranger outside felt their skin crawl with its vibration. And then, the strangest part, the priest cradled the skull like an infant, rocking it gently as if soothing it to sleep. The others joined, their voices softening into lullabies that did not comfort but unsettled. It was at once tender and terrifying. The stranger backed away from the doorway, their heart pounding, legs weak. Whatever they had just witnessed, it was not for foreign eyes. And yet the city had allowed them this glimpse, as though daring them to understand. They turned, intending to retreat quietly, to vanish back into the safety of the canal's darkness. But as they stepped away, a twig snapped beneath their foot. The sound was sharp, unmistakable, cruelly loud in the silence of the night. Inside, the chanting stopped. The sound cracked through the night like lightning splitting a tree. The stranger froze, breath caught in their throat, heart slamming so hard it seemed loud enough to give them away. Inside the reed-walled chamber, the chanting died instantly. The lullaby broke into silence. For a moment, even the fire seemed to dim. Then came the rustle of movement. Mats shifted. Feet scuffed the packed dirt. Someone muttered a phrase sharp and low, like a blade sliding from its sheath. The stranger pressed back against the outer wall, body trembling, every nerve screaming at them to flee. Yet their legs would not move. The reeds of the doorway parted. A masked face emerged, painted white with black streaks curling down the cheeks. The figure's eyes scanned the canal's edge, narrow and sharp as obsidian. For one terrifying instant, they seemed to lock on the stranger's shadow. The stranger's lungs burned. If they ran now, the splash of their canoe would betray them. If they stayed, discovery was almost certain. The figure stepped fully outside, head tilting as if listening to the night itself. A silence stretched so taut it might snap. Then slowly, the priest turned back inside, the reeds falling into place once more. The stranger exhaled in a silent rush, knees weak, gripping the wall for balance. They dared not wait. Slipping back into the canoe, they pushed off as quietly as they could, letting the current carry them away before paddling again. The water rippled softly, swallowing their escape. Only when the building faded into the shadows behind did the stranger allow themselves a single shuddering breath of relief. The canal stretched wide now, opening into one of the larger waterways that cut through Tenochtitlan's heart. Torches burned brighter here, lining walkways that glistened with fresh rain. Boats moved lazily in the night, fishermen hauling in nets, lovers drifting close together, and families ferrying home baskets of fruit. The city breathed again, its menace hidden beneath the ordinary. But the stranger could not shake the image of the skull. Those hollow eyes, adorned with feathers, had felt alive in their gaze. It was no simple ornament. It had meaning, power, perhaps even a soul. The lullaby still clung to their ears, soft and sinister. The more they thought of it, the more they realized the public rituals of the temple, as bloody as they were, had been meant for the masses. This, whatever it was, felt older, more secret, and far less forgiving. The strangers paddle dipped again into the water, the rhythm soothing but shaky. They tried to focus on the world around them. To the right, a row of houses leaned toward the canal, their reed roofs dripping from the evening's mist. Laughter drifted from within, warm, familial, and startling in its normalcy after the shadows of the shrine. The smell of roasted cacao beans floated from one doorway, earthy and rich, mingling with the scent of honey. For a moment, the stranger's stomach growled. Somehow, even in the most terrifying places, hunger had a way of reminding one they were alive. They couldn't help but think of a chocolate bar from a vending machine. Foil, wrapped, machine dispensed, eaten mindlessly while scrolling on a phone. Here, chocolate was something sacred, ground by hand on stone, mixed with spices, frothed with care until it foamed like liquid velvet. The comparison was almost insulting, and yet it grounded them. The human need for comfort food hadn't changed, only the recipes had. As they drifted further along the canal, the stranger began to notice something else. The city didn't sleep. Not really. Torches marked taverns where men gathered with gourds of pulque, laughing too loud, slapping each other's backs as music clattered from wooden drums. Women passed by with baskets balanced on their heads, still trading fish for maize even at this hour. Children chased one another along the walkways, shrieking with joy, their shadows racing beside them. The city pulsed constantly, refusing to rest, as if Tenochtitlan feared silence more than exhaustion. And yet, under the liveliness, the stranger felt eyes on them. Not from the revelers nor the families, but from the city itself. As if every stone causeway, every chinampa garden, every torch knew they did not belong. The stranger shifted uneasily in the canoe, their earlier encounter lingering like a stain on their thoughts. They had witnessed something forbidden, something meant to stay hidden in the folds of the city's night. And though they had escape in Tenochtitlan never seemed permanent. The canal bent, leading toward a vast open square. Rising from its center was a pyramid smaller than the great temple but no less commanding. Its surface gleamed faintly with mosaics of turquoise and obsidian, catching the firelight in dazzling fragments. People streamed toward it, carrying flowers, baskets of maize, and painted gourds. The stranger recognized this rhythm now, another ritual, but not of blood. Curiosity tugged at them again, stronger this time. Laced with the fragile hope that not all devotion ended with knives, they steered the canoe toward the bank, tying it loosely to a post, and joined the crowd heading toward the temple. The closer they came, the sweeter the air grew. Incense burned thick, mingled with the perfume of marigolds and copal. The sound here was softer too, flutes trilling, drums tapping gently like a heartbeat at rest. At the temple's base, women laid offerings of flowers, while men poured frothing cacao into shallow cups, setting them before the altar. Children placed small carved animals, jaguars, birds, serpents, into woven baskets, giggling as they arranged them carefully. The stranger stood among them, caught in the strange warmth of it all. This was no spectacle of terror, no demand for blood. It was gratitude, joy, the kind of devotion that lifted rather than consumed. The city showed another face here, and it was almost tender. For a moment, the stranger let their shoulders relax, the knot of fear in their chest loosening. Perhaps this was the balance, life and death, terror and beauty, all woven together in the city's tapestry. They closed their eyes, listening to the flutes, smelling the marigolds, and almost believed themselves safe. But safety in Tenochtitlan was always fleeting. As the music rose, the stranger felt a tug at their sleeve. They turned sharply, A boy no older than 10 stared up at them, his eyes sharp, too knowing for his age. In his small hand, he held something wrapped in cloth, and as he opened it, the stranger's blood ran cold. Inside lay a fragment of polished bone, carved with symbols that seemed to writhe under the firelight. The boy smiled faintly, as though he knew the stranger had already seen its twin in the shadows of the secret shrine. He whispered a phrase in Nahuatl, too soft to catch fully, then pressed the fragment into the stranger's hand before darting back into the crowd. The stranger stared at it, heart pounding, the warmth of marigolds and cacao suddenly soaring in their throat. Wherever they went, whatever corner of the city they turned to, the shadow of that skull was following, and the next place it led would not be forgiving. The fragment felt heavier than it should have, though it was no larger than a palm. Its edges were smooth, polished by careful hands, yet the carved symbols along its surface caught against the skin like tiny barbs. They seemed to shimmer under the firelight, shifting whenever the stranger tried to fix them in focus. No matter how they turned it, the fragment refused to rest. It was as though the bone itself resisted stillness, alive with whispers that could not quite be heard. The boy had vanished. No trace remained except the faint patter of feet, and the echo of his words, still rattling inside the stranger's ears. The crowd continued their offerings at the smaller temple, oblivious, their laughter and songs carrying on without pause. Life flowed normally, but the fragment burned in the stranger's hand like a secret that could not be put down. They tucked it quickly into their tunic, though the weight seemed no lighter there. Every step they took, every breath they drew, carried the awareness that it was with them, a reminder stitched into their very movement. And with that awareness came a sudden clarity. They were no longer a bystander drifting through Tenochtitlan. They had been noticed, chosen perhaps, marked. The plaza narrowed into another canal side path, torches sputtering in the night air. The stranger walked faster, their sandals scraping the stone, the fragment knocking against their ribs with every step. They passed a pair of women carrying baskets of maize, who offered polite nods without suspicion. But just beyond them, at the shadowed corner of a bridge, a figure waited. Tall, cloaked, face hidden behind a mask of jaguar teeth, the figure leaned casually against the wall. His presence was unmistakably deliberate. The stranger slowed, their pulse hammering, but the figure did not move. He simply tilted his head slightly, as though he already knew what the stranger carried. The urge to run surged hot and wild. Yet running through the narrow streets of Tenochtitlan meant more than escape. It meant crashing into 1,000 other lives, each with their own watchful eyes. Instead, the stranger did what they had done since first arriving. They pretended not to notice, pretended to belong. They walked on, steady, eyes down. But as they passed beneath the shadow of the jaguar mask, the figure spoke. His voice was low, gravelly, carrying the weight of someone used to obedience. "Careful where you wander, traveller." The words were in Nahuatl, yet somehow the meaning reached the stranger's ears as clearly as their own tongue. The cadence was slow, deliberate, almost mocking. The stranger's breath caught, but they didn't dare look up. They kept walking, sandals clicking faster, now against the stone bridge. Behind them, the figure did not follow, but his laughter did. Soft, deep, curling through the night air until it faded into the hum of the city. The stranger didn't stop until the canal opened into another square. Here, the atmosphere shifted again. Lanterns swayed from wooden beams. Musicians played flutes in bright trills, and dancers moved in slow circles, their feathered skirts rippling like water. This was no ritual, no secret rite. It was a festival, spilling warmth and light into the darkness. The stranger's chest heaved as they stood at the edge of the crowd, caught between fear and fascination. Everywhere they turned, colour-blazed painted faces smiling with pulque, stained lips, children darting with flower garlands, warriors showing off strength in playful contests of balance. Food stalls lined the edges, their fires spitting with roasted peppers and sizzling fish. The air was thick with spice, sweetened with honey, and sharpened by smoke. For the first time since arriving in the city, the stranger felt temptation outweigh dread. They drifted toward the stalls, following the smell of tortillas pressed hot on clay griddles. One vendor slapped masa with quick hands, tossing each round into the fire until it puffed lightly, then topping it with beans, chilies, and crumbly white cheese. The stranger accepted one, biting into it without hesitation. The taste was overwhelming: earthy beans, smoky chilies, soft bread still warm from the flame. It was, they realized, basically the ancestor of a taco. And suddenly, the thought of explaining to these people that someday their food would become a fast food drive, through menu item for late night cravings was almost funny enough to make them choke. Imagine the vendor's face if someone offered him a hard shell stuffed with neon orange cheese powder. The gods would have demanded sacrifices on the spot. The stranger laughed quietly to themselves, the absurdity of the thought easing their chest. For a moment, they could almost forget the weight of the bone fragment. Almost. As music swelled, dancers twirled faster, feathers spinning in dazzling circles of green, blue, and gold. The crowd cheered, clapping in rhythm, their joy infectious. A young woman, her hair braided with marigolds, caught the stranger's eye and beckoned them forward. Before they could protest, she pulled them into the dance. The rhythm carried them. Feet stomping, arms lifting. The stranger stumbled at first, but soon found themselves caught in the pulse. Laughter burst around them, laughter they couldn't help but join. The stranger spun, the firelight dizzying, the marigolds brushing their cheek as the woman smiled. For a fleeting moment, it was easy to believe they belonged. But then, mid-step, the fragment in their tunics shifted, pressing hard against their ribs. The laughter around them dimmed. The drums in the distance seemed louder, sharper, pulling them back into the reminder that joy in this city was always shadowed by something darker. The dance ended in applause. The woman released their hand, vanishing into the crowd with a smile that lingered like a ghost. The stranger stood alone again, breathless, the night heavy on their shoulders. And when they looked toward the edge of the square, they saw him. The jaguar-masked figure, watching. The jaguar's gaze pinned them, unmoving, unblinking. Even in the shifting torchlight, the figure seemed carved from shadow. The stranger froze where they stood, the press of bodies around them suddenly meaningless. Music and laughter blurred into background noise, as though the city itself tilted away from all else to leave only this moment. He did not approach at once. Instead, he lingered on the edge of the square, half hidden by a column of carved stone. The mask's teeth gleamed faintly, white against the night. The stranger's pulse climbed higher, each thud in their chest louder than the drums. Finally, with the deliberate patience of a predator, the jaguar moved. Not directly toward them, but circling, weaving through the crowd. People parted subtly, though none looked his way. It was as if the entire festival instinctively knew better than to block his path. The stranger turned sharply, pushing through dancers, trying to lose themselves in the chaos of feathers and flutes. Their sandals slid against the slick stones, heart hammering in time with the drums. Yet no matter how many steps they took, the certainty grew the jaguar was close behind. The canal appeared suddenly before them, black water reflecting torchlight like shards of obsidian. Small boats bobbed against the edge, their hulls creaking as families prepared to drift home. Without thinking, the stranger stepped onto the nearest vessel, offering a frantic nod to the ferryman. He was an older man, face weathered like cracked bark, who raised a brow but said nothing. With a push of his pole, the boat slid silently into the canal. Relief flooded briefly through the stranger. The crowd shrank behind them, the festival's noise thinning into echoes. The canal was cool, quiet, bordered by reeds that whispered in the night breeze. Stars shimmered faintly in the water's surface. But then came the sound. Another boat, gliding smooth as a shadow, following at a measured distance. The jaguar figure stood tall in its prow, the mask gleaming. No words, no rush. Just the relentless certainty of pursuit. The ferryman muttered under his breath, his eyes darting uneasily to the figure behind them. "Best not to carry what isn't yours," he said quietly, without turning. His words struck like a knife. The stranger stiffened, fingers brushing the bone fragment through their tunic. "You know?" the stranger whispered, their voice trembling. The ferryman said nothing more, only dipped his pole into the water, propelling the boat faster. Yet his silence confirmed everything. The fragment was no secret. Not here. Perhaps never. The canal forked ahead, splitting into two narrow passages. Without waiting for instruction, the ferryman steered sharply left, choosing the darker path. Overhanging trees cast heavy shadows, their roots twisting down into the water like skeletal hands. The boat scraped along reeds and driftwood as the man drove it deeper, further from the main city lights. The jaguar followed. Always the same distance. Never closer, never farther. Finally, the ferryman drew the boat to a stop beneath a stone archway, nearly swallowed by vines. He looked at the stranger, his eyes sharp now despite the haze of age. "This is where I leave you. If you keep it, it will lead you here again." He gestured to the archway. "If you throw it away, perhaps you'll wake tomorrow like any other soul, with no memory of this night." The stranger's throat tightened. The bone fragment burned against their skin, almost as though it had heard the choice. Could they truly discard it, return to anonymity, safe among the faceless festival crowd? Or was it already too late for that? Behind them, the sound of the second boat scraping closer sent a cold rush through their veins. The jaguar's shadow loomed. Without another word, the ferryman shoved the boat hard toward the archway. The stranger ducked, clutching the fragment, and the vessel slid beneath vines into a space of near darkness. The canal narrowed to a cavernous chamber, stone walls slick with moisture, air damp and cold. Torches guttered along the edges, casting erratic light on murals painted across the walls. Images of jaguars, serpents, and skulls twined together in scenes of sacrifice and fire. The stranger's breath caught the style was older than anything they'd seen in the city above. Ancient. Predecessors of the Mexica, perhaps, leaving stories few remembered. The boat drifted to a halt against a small stone platform. The stranger stepped out cautiously, their sandals clicking on the wet surface. The fragment throbbed in their palm now, pulsing faintly with heat, as if alive. And then a voice rose from the shadows. Not the jaguar's gravelly tone, but softer, layered. Several voices speaking as one. "You carry what was broken, and what was broken must be mended." The stranger froze, turning slowly. Figures emerged from the edges of the chamber, their faces painted in white and red, bodies draped in jaguar pelts and serpent skins. They formed a circle, their steps measured, their chants low. The torches brightened as though fed by unseen breath, illuminating the space in harsh orange light. At the far end of the chamber, a stone altar stood. Upon it, bones lay arranged in deliberate patterns, ribs fanning outward, skulls stacked like steps, femurs lined in rows. It was both grotesque and mesmerizing, a geometry of death. The fragment in the stranger's hand grew hotter, almost unbearable. Instinctively they held it out. The painted figures stopped their circling, their many voices blending into a single command. "Place it upon the altar." The stranger's knees shook. Their mouth went dry. Yet they stepped forward, each movement pulled not by will but by inevitability. The altar loomed, the skulls seeming to watch, hollow eyes reflecting fire. With trembling hands, they set the fragment down among the bones. The moment it touched stone, the entire chamber seemed to shudder. Murals rippled, as though alive. The circle of figures fell silent, heads bowed. The fragment glowed faintly, light seeping through its carvings like molten gold. And then, just as suddenly, it went dark, cold, lifeless. The chamber stilled. The stranger stared at the altar, heart pounding. Had they done what was asked? Or had they triggered something worse? The jaguar stepped from the shadows. He had entered silently, unseen until now, mask gleaming in the flickering fire. His laughter, soft and deep, echoed across the chamber. "You've chosen," he said, "and choices have teeth." The The city at night was not the same as it had been under the burnished glow of festival torches. Midnight stripped the laughter away. The air grew colder, heavier, as if water and stone conspired to hold their breath. The canals lay still, mirrors of obsidian, disturbed only by the occasional ripple of a passing canoe. The stranger walked alone now, footsteps echoing faintly on slick stones, each sound too loud in the suffocating quiet. The path toward the temple was marked by silence as much as shadow. No vendors called from their stalls. No children darted between alleys. Even the dogs, earlier snarling over scraps, had curled themselves into corners, eyes glowing faint in the dark but bodies unmoving. It was as though the entire city had agreed, wordlessly, that midnight belonged to someone else. The stranger pulled the crude mask tighter against their chest, its painted teeth grinning up mockingly. Each step closer to the temple tightened their ribs, yet their feet refused to stop. The words lingered, temple steps, and the compulsion weighed heavier than choice. Perhaps, they thought bitterly, this was how people ended up at gyms in January. Not desire, not love for pain, but compulsion. The great temple rose ahead, darker than the sky itself, its shape a jagged silhouette against stars. Torches sputtered at its base, their flames weak, as though reluctant to burn so close to that mass of stone. The stairs, which earlier had pulsed with music and blood, now loomed empty. Each step stretched upward, a path carved not for humans but for giants. The stranger swallowed, throat dry. And then they heard it, the faint scrape of sandals on stone. Not behind them, not ahead, but above, as though someone, or many, already waited halfway up the stairs. The sound came irregular, sometimes one set of footsteps, sometimes several, as if invisible figures moved in tandem, climbing and stopping, climbing and stopping. The stranger's pulse quickened. The temple was not empty. Midnight had its congregation. They began to climb. The first steps were shallow, deceptively easy. But soon the incline grew crueler, each rise demanding more from legs already trembling. The stone was cold beneath their sandals, the air thinner with every breath. Their bodies screamed at them to stop, but the thought of standing motionless on those stairs while unseen feet scraped above was worse. Halfway up, the city revealed itself behind them, sprawling in endless geometry. Canals glimmered like black veins, streets straight as rulers, causeways cutting outward into the lake like spearheads. Even in darkness, the order of it struck a city too precise, too vast to have been thrown together by chance. For a moment, awe eclipsed fear. They thought of their own city, wherever home was. Traffic jams, potholes, buildings stacked without grace. Tenochtitlan, even in shadow, felt like it had been designed by a hand far steadier than human. The awe broke as a whisper touched their ear. "You are late." The stranger spun, nearly losing balance. A figure stood one step above, no more than an arm's length away. It was the storyteller, the man from the square, who had spoken of rabbits and moons. But now his face bore no cheer. Shadows carved hollows beneath his eyes, and his mouth curved neither in smile nor frown. He turned, climbing higher, and the stranger followed because to do otherwise felt impossible. The scrape of sandals above resumed, multiplying, though no figures could be seen. The stairs seemed to stretch longer, twisting subtly, as though the temple itself grew with every step. At last, the summit. The platform spread wide, its edges guarded by low walls etched with glyphs. Fires smouldered in shallow pits, smoke coiling upward, thick with the smell of copal resin, sweet, suffocating. At the platform's center stood the altar, its surface still stained dark. But it was not the altar that drew the stranger's gaze. Figures circled the platform, each masked, each draped in skins of jaguar, coyote, or eagle. Their movements were slow, deliberate, a rhythm without music, like dancers moving to the sound of their own blood. The jaguar was among them, unmistakable in his towering mask, though now he seemed almost ordinary within the pack. The storyteller gestured toward the altar. "It is not enough to watch," he said. "Tonight, you must learn what it feels like." The stranger froze. A chill crawled their spine, pooling heavy in their stomach. The circle of masked figures stilled. turning as one to face them. Even without eyes visible, the weight of their attention crushed. "What feels like?" the stranger asked, though their voice cracked. "Sacrifice," the storyteller said simply. The word landed like a stone dropped into water. The stranger staggered back, heart slamming against ribs. Their mouth opened to protest, to plead, but the jaguar raised his hand. The circle stepped aside, leaving a clear path to the altar. "No," the stranger whispered, shaking their head. "No, I don't belong here." The storyteller's lips twitched. "And yet, here you are." The city chooses. Two masked figures approached, not roughly but firmly, their hands on the stranger's arms guiding them forward. The altar loomed closer, the stone surface slick in the fire's glow. Their legs buckled, but resistance felt futile. The circle's weight pressed them on. The altar was cold, brutally cold, as they were laid upon it. The sky above spun dizzy with stars, sharp points of light blurred by smoke. The stranger's chest heaved, breaths ragged. The jaguar stepped forward, obsidian blade glinting. For a moment, silence reigned. The city below was forgotten, the festival. The laughter, everything shrank until only this platform, this blade, this breath remained. And then the jaguar's blade struck. Not flesh, stone. The blade slammed against the altar beside the stranger's head, sparks flying as obsidian shattered. The jaguar leaned low, his mask inches from their face. "No, you know how it feels," he murmured. "To lie here, to wonder if your breath is your last. Remember it." The stranger's chest convulsed, relief and terror tangling until neither could be told apart. The circle erupted in laughter, not cruel, not joyous, but something in between. A sound that felt older than humor itself. The storyteller helped the stranger sit, his grip surprisingly gentle. "You are not ready to die," he said, "but you are ready to see." From the far side of the platform, a stone slab was pulled aside, revealing a stairwell plunging down into darkness. A draft of air wafted upward, damp and metallic, smelling of rust and earth. The jaguar gestured. The stranger hesitated, still trembling, but when the circle began to descend, they had no choice but to follow. The stairwell spiraled, each step narrower, the air thicker. Walls pressed close, painted with glyphs half, faded but still pulsing faintly with ochre reds and blacks. The deeper they went, the colder it grew, until each breath was visible as mist. At the bottom lay a cavernous hall. Torches sputtered in sconces, revealing rows upon rows of skulls set into racks, their hollow eyes staring endlessly forward, but zompantly, the skull racks of sacrifice. The stranger stopped dead, nausea rising sharp and hot. Hundreds, no, thousands, of skulls, some polished white, others yellowed with age, grinned from their bindings. Their teeth caught torchlight, gleaming like a field of stars inverted. The jaguar's voice rumbled. "Hair is what builds a city, not only stone, not only maze, but belief. Every skull is a stone in its foundation. Without them, Tenochtitlan is only mud." The circle moved among the racks reverently, touching skulls as if greeting ancestors. The storyteller paused beside one particularly large skull, cracked down the center, and traced its fracture gently. "These are the truths your people would call horror. Yet without them, there is no order, no harvest, no sun. What you call cruel, we call necessary." The stranger swallowed hard. Their hands trembled, yet some small part of them understood. Not agreed, but understood. Cities were not built on kindness. Even theirs, with its traffic and bills and forgotten neighbors, was built on sacrifices, though the forms had changed. A laugh bubbled suddenly from their chest, wild, nervous, uncontrollable. It startled even them. "Where we pay rent," they stammered between gasps. "Every month. Maybe that's our skull rack." The circle turned, watching silently. The jaguar tilted his head, then let out a single, low chuckle. The sound was strange, almost human beneath the mask. The hall of skulls stretched deeper, endless, until walls melted into darkness. The stranger felt their knees weaken, the weight of eyes, empty yet eternal, pressing on them. But somewhere beyond that black expanse, a faint light pulsed, faint as a heartbeat. The storyteller spoke again, softer now. If you think this is the end, you are wrong. The city hides more than bones. Deeper still lies what even we do not name. If you would see it, follow. The stranger turned toward the pulse of light, chest tightening. Whatever lay beyond, it promised no peace, no rest. But choice had slipped long ago, like the fragment on the altar, like the mask in their hand. They stepped forward, into the endless dark. The sun had long since dipped behind the rim of the valley, and Tenochtitlan glowed like a constellation pulled down to earth. Torches lined the causeways, their reflections bending and trembling in the black glass of the lake, while fires burned within courtyards and homes. It was night now, but the city was far from silent. If the days belonged to the marketplace, then the nights belonged to the gods, to song, and to shadows. The stranger found themselves wandering, their steps guided less by intention and more by curiosity, as though the city itself was leading them forward. The first sound that drew them deeper was the hum of voices, low and steady, threaded together with the soft beat of a drum. They followed it down a narrow lane that opened suddenly into a courtyard where a dozen men and women knelt in a circle, their faces turned upward. At the center stood a priest, his feathered headdress catching the light of a single torch. He sang in a rising chant, words that pulsed like the heartbeat of the city. The kneeling crowd echoed his phrases, their voices weaving into a sound so hypnotic that the stranger's chest tightened, as though some invisible hand had reached inside and pressed against their ribs. Incense thickened the air, curling in lazy ribbons that burned the throat and left the tongue tasting bitter, metallic. The stranger coughed quietly, earning a few sharp looks from the kneelers. To them, this was no performance, but the most sacred rhythm of life. For a moment, the stranger felt as though they had stumbled into a secret they had no right to see, as though the walls of the courtyard themselves might close in to swallow them. They stepped back into the street quickly, heart pounding. Yet once outside, the sounds of the city washed over them again, different this time. Laughter spilled from open doorways, accompanied by the plucking of strings and the hollow clatter of percussion. The stranger turned toward it, following until they found a gathering of young men playing music with instruments carved from bone and wood, while women danced in slow, swaying patterns, their skirts flaring like painted fans. A child darted past the stranger carrying roasted maize, giggling as grease dripped down his chin. A dog barked and chased him, though it seemed more interested in the food than the boy. The stranger smiled, almost despite themselves. It was strange to think that this same city that smelled of blood and echoed with drums of sacrifice could also hold moments so tender and ordinary. The dancers turned in unison, their bare feet striking the earth in soft thunder, and for a fleeting second, the stranger wondered what it would feel like to join them, to be absorbed into the rhythm, to belong instead of hover at the edges like a shadow. But that thought was interrupted by a sudden cry, a high, keening note that carried across the water. The crowd stilled, eyes shifting toward the sound. Some murmured prayers, others bowed their heads. The stranger strained to see, but the night was too deep, the canals too wide. Yet the sound lingered, echoing long after silence should have returned. One man beside the stranger whispered, almost reverently, La Llorona. The name meant nothing at first, but the chill in his voice was unmistakable. He crossed himself, though not in the way the Spaniards would later, but in the ancient gesture of protection. The stranger shivered, realizing that even in this great city, where the gods walked in stone and smoke, there were still whispers of spirits that haunted the dark. The laughter of the dancers resumed, but more subdued now, as though each step might stir something unseen. The stranger slipped away again, their heart heavy. The city had shifted once more, showing its face of fear. Night was not only for music and prayer, it was also for shadows, for the things that could not be explained. The streets narrowed ahead, leading toward the lake's edge. Here, the air cooled, damp and sweet, carrying the scent of water lilies. Across the dark waters, fires twinkled from floating gardens and distant causeways. like scattered embers in an endless black sea. Somewhere out there, the stranger thought, priests still sang, lovers still whispered, and children still dreamed. But here, alone at the edge of the city, it was only them and the faint ripple of water lapping at the stones. They crouched, dipped their fingers into the lake. It was warmer than expected, almost alive, and as they withdrew, droplets clung stubbornly to their skin. A voice, gentle, almost playful, seemed to stir in the reeds. They froze, breath caught. But when they turned, it was only the night breeze, pushing reeds into one another like whispering conspirators. The stranger exhaled, laughing softly to break the tension. How ridiculous! To think the city itself might be speaking. Yet the laughter didn't quite dispel the feeling that eyes, unseen and ancient, were watching. Always watching. And still, despite fear, despite the weight of strangeness, the stranger leaned forward, straining to see more. What lay beyond the edge of night? Beyond the reach of torches, where the city blurred into endless water. That question pressed against their ribs, like the drumbeat they had heard before, insistent and impossible to ignore. If the daylight of Tenochtitlan revealed its grandeur and its cruelty, then the night revealed something else. Its secrets, its spirits, its unseen pulse. And soon the stranger would learn that some truths could only be found in the dark. The city was not asleep. Tenochtitlan, vast and glittering, thrummed with a midnight energy that seemed to breathe from the lake itself. The moon hung high, silvering the canals and rooftops, while torchlight flickered along the causeways like molten veins running through a living body. From above, the city must have looked like a jewel burning against the dark. Perfectly measured streets, floating gardens, towers rising, the great temples piercing the sky. But here at ground level, the stranger walked as though through a dream that teetered on the edge of nightmare. The streets were quieter now than in the day, yet not silent. They carried different sounds: the hollow call of night birds, the occasional splash as a canoe slipped through a canal, the faint rattling of drums far in the distance. From some doorways spilled laughter and music, the songs of families or neighbors lingering late into the night. But between those pockets of warmth were stretches of shadow, where the silence seemed thick enough to choke. It was in these moments that the stranger most keenly felt the city's immensity, not just its size, but its layers. A city like this was not simply built, it was stacked layer upon layer of belief, ritual, and fear. The stone temples reached skyward, but beneath them lay older stones, older gods, buried yet not forgotten. Even the lake itself whispered of stories too ancient to name. The stranger found himself imagining what it would be like to live here always, to grow up hearing the temple drums instead of church bells, to learn that blood was a language spoken daily to keep the world in balance. Would it make sense eventually? Or would the unease never fade? The smell of cooking drifted faintly from somewhere. A family roasting maize or heating a stew of beans and chili. It mixed oddly with the sharper scent of copal resin, still burning near a shrine. Incense and smoke, food and water. This was the perfume of Tenochtitlan at night. The stranger inhaled, trying to hold the city inside their chest, as though memorizing it. And then, suddenly laughter broke out nearby. Not the warm laughter of family, but sharp, high and mocking. The stranger turned a corner and froze. A group of men, their faces painted, stood around a smaller figure kneeling in the dust. The kneeling one muttered words too quiet to catch, while the others jeered and circled, prodding him with wooden sticks. The stranger could not understand the exchange fully, but the tone was unmistakable. This was not ritual or performance, it was cruelty. One of the painted men spat into the dirt. Another struck the kneeling man's shoulder, hard enough to make him stumble sideways. The stranger's hands twitched uselessly. Intervening would be madness. They were alone, a foreign body in a city that would not understand their tongue. So they stood very still, heart racing, and watched. It did not last long. A shout rang out from a doorway, an older woman's voice, commanding and fierce. The painted men stilled, exchanged uneasy glances. then melted into the shadows with surprising swiftness. The kneeling man rose slowly, rubbing his arm. He glanced toward the stranger, and for a heartbeat, their eyes met. His expression was unreadable. Wariness, shame, perhaps something like defiance. And then he too vanished into the labyrinth of streets. The stranger exhaled only then, realizing their hands had been clenched into fists. The city showed kindness and cruelty in alternating breaths, like an enormous living thing with moods that shifted without warning. It was terrifying. It was also intoxicating. A sudden gust stirred the canals, sending ripples across the black water. The moonlight broke into shards, flashing like silver knives. Somewhere across the lake, a dog howled, a long, low cry that made the skin crawl. And then, faint but distinct, came the answering beat of drums. They were slower now, not the frenzied rhythm of sacrifice, but something steady and deliberate, as if summoning. The stranger moved toward the sound. It drew them like a tide, through narrower lanes, past shuttered homes, past tiny shrines where candles still burned in clay bowls. The drums grew louder, until at last the street opened into a small square. There they saw it, a ritual, quieter than the ones atop the pyramids, but no less potent. A circle of women sat cross-legged, their hair braided with flowers, their hands weaving patterns in the air as they sang. At the center of the circle, a child lay on a woven mat, eyes closed, while a priest moved around him, shaking a rattle made of shells. The song was lilting, rising and falling like the lake itself. The stranger did not understand the words, but they knew, without doubt, that this was healing. The air here felt different, calmer. Even the shadows seemed to soften, as though leaning in to listen. The stranger's chest loosened. For a moment they felt safe, held within a pocket of the city's heart. The ritual ended gently. The child stirred, sat up, blinked sleepily. His mother embraced him, relief spilling from her face. The women laughed softly, their song fading into chatter. The stranger lingered only a moment longer, afraid that if they stayed they would be noticed, marked as the outsider they were. They slipped back into the streets, but carried the sound with them, like a secret talisman. Night deepened. The city's rhythm slowed. More doorways went dark, more canals emptied of traffic, until it seemed the city might finally be resting. The stranger found himself back at the edge of the lake, staring out at the black expanse. Tenochtitlan was enormous, alive, ungraspable, yet here it looked fragile too. Fires flickering against the void, human lives burning in the vastness. And still, the city did not release its grip. The stranger felt both lost and found, terrified and exhilarated, as though every street whispered, "Stay, stay and see more." The lake stirred again, and for a moment the stranger thought they saw something move upon its surface. Not a canoe, not a bird, but something older, sliding just beneath the rippling skin of the water. They blinked, and it was gone. But the unease remained. The city of Tenochtitlan did not sleep. It only shifted, waiting, promising that whatever tomorrow brought would be stranger still. And the stranger, lost yet bound to its heart, realized that leaving might no longer be possible. If you thought the city's nights carried secrets, wait until the morning reveals what stirs in the markets when the sun returns. Dawn arrived like a blade cutting through the darkness, sharp and sudden. One moment, the city lay wrapped in shadows, its torches flickering faintly against the vast black of the lake. The next, a burst of orange spilled over the mountains, painting the sky in streaks of fire and gold. The water caught it instantly, reflecting back so brightly it hurt the eyes. Tenochtitlan woke not with hesitation, but with a surge, as though the first light was a command. Drums sounded again, not ominous this time but triumphant, calling the people into their day. The stranger blinked at the brilliance, the sheer immensity of the city laid bare once more. From every doorway, people spilled onto the streets. Men carrying baskets, women balancing clay pots, children tugging at the hems of their tunics. The smell of cooking fires thickened the air, filling it with roasted maize, beans, chili peppers. Canoes pushed out into the canals like an army of waterborne ants, laden with goods from the Chinampas. Tenochtitlan was awake, and there would be no ignoring it. The stranger moved with the tide, swept into a broad avenue that pulsed toward the markets. Already, the noise rose, the calls of merchants advertising their wares, the squawk of caged birds, the bleating of goats and turkeys brought in for sale. The market square itself opened wide and dazzling, a sea of colour and movement. Stalls crammed side by side overflowed with food, fabrics, obsidian knives, clay vessels, feathered cloaks that shimmered like sunlight trapped in cloth. The stranger had thought they had seen abundance the day before, but this was something else entirely. Here, the empire itself seemed to have gathered in one place. Traders from distant lands wore cloaks of different weave, speaking in accents that twisted the tongue. Piles of cacao beans were guarded like treasure, while slaves stood quietly at the edges, their silence heavier than any goods on offer. The smell of fresh tortillas mingled with the harsher tang of drying fish, while somewhere close by, a vendor called out the virtues of a remedy for toothaches, holding up bundles of herbs. It was overwhelming, dizzying, and yet the stranger could not look away. Every sense was assaulted: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. A boy darted past, pressing a roasted grasshopper into the stranger's hand before laughing and disappearing into the crowd. The stranger stared at the crunchy little body, grimaced, and slipped it into their pocket, telling themselves perhaps it was best not to offend the hospitality of a city where offense could cost more than dignity. The crush of people carried them further, until they reached the heart of the market, where a raised platform stood. Here, order was enforced. Judges in fine cloaks sat with serious expressions, watching the crowds. If a thief was caught, punishment would be swift, and everyone knew it. The stranger shivered slightly, realizing how thin the line was between the city's vibrancy and its ruthless control. And yet, even here, humor cracked through. Two merchants shouted over one another, each claiming their chile peppers were spicier, their voices growing so loud that the crowd gathered in anticipation. One finally thrust a pepper toward the other's mouth, daring him to prove his claim. The man bit, chewed, and within seconds, tears streamed down his face, his breath heaving as the crowd erupted into laughter. The stranger found themselves laughing too, the sound slipping out before they could think to contain it. Perhaps in this city of gods and blood, there was still room for something as simple as a joke at a chili contest. But laughter could not erase the other sights. At the edge of the market, a small group had gathered around a body laid out on a mat. It was not unusual here. Death was woven into the city's fabric. But the stranger's stomach still tightened. The dead man's relatives spoke calmly, discussing what offerings must be given, what rites must be followed. To them, grief was ritual, controlled and necessary. The stranger turned away, unsettled by how quickly life and death brushed against one another here, as casually as neighbors in a street. The market stretched endlessly. The stranger wandered deeper, brushing shoulders with women balancing trays of tamales, with warriors in jaguar skins bargaining for obsidian blades. A stall displayed tiny clay figurines of gods, each painted in bright pigments, while another sold polished mirrors of obsidian, so dark the stranger saw their reflection as though staring into a pool of black water. They leaned closer, and for a heartbeat, it felt as if the mirror were gazing back, not reflecting but watching. They pulled away quickly, unsettled. Somewhere behind, the drumbeats shifted, slower, heavier, pulling the crowd's attention. Priests had entered the square, feathered cloaks trailing, their presence impossible to ignore. The noise dimmed. A hush rippled outward. The stranger felt the hair on their arms rise. The priests moved to the platform, chanting in low tones, their hands raised toward the sun. Even in the heart of commerce, the gods demanded their share. People bowed, offering prayers, dropping coins and beans onto woven mats. The stranger stood among them, torn between awe and unease. In this city, faith was not something set apart. It was in the water, in the breath, in the market stalls themselves. Every act, even the buying of maize, was part of a balance too great to fully grasp. As the chants faded, The market roared back to life, louder than before, as though the city itself had exhaled. The stranger drifted with it, still dazed, still caught between fascination and dread. This place was alive in a way unlike any other, each corner a collision of splendor and fear. And yet, just as the stranger began to feel swallowed by it, a small moment anchored them. A woman selling flowers caught their eye and smiled, pressing a marigold into their hand without a word. The scent was sharp, sweet, grounding. For the first time that morning, the stranger breathed deeply, steadying themselves. Perhaps Tenochtitlan was overwhelming because it was not one city but many, layered and shifting, capable of cruelty, beauty, and tenderness in equal measure. Still clutching the marigold, the stranger stepped back into the tide of bodies, wondering what the city would reveal next. And if you thought the markets were overwhelming, wait until you see what happens when the city gathers not for trade, but for war. The marigold was still warm in the stranger's hand when the market began to thin, its frenzy slowly breaking apart into smaller currents. Canoes glided back into the canals, baskets were lifted onto shoulders, and the morning roar softened into something steadier. But not all of the city was returning home. A different sound was rising now, carried on the wind. Low, steady, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Drums again, but not the kind that accompanied prayers or healing songs. These were heavier, more martial, each beat sharp as a spear thrust. The stranger followed the sound. The tide of people flowed toward a wide square near one of the great temples, and it became clear quickly this was no festival, no market day. Warriors were assembling. They came in from every direction, some already dressed in the skins and feathers that marked their ranks, others adjusting helmets or painting their faces with streaks of red and black. Eagle warriors in feathered headdresses that caught the sun, jaguar warriors with snarling masks, their bodies painted in spots. Their movements were confident, deliberate, each gesture announcing training and pride. The stranger had seen soldiers before. Roman ruins spoke of them, medieval castles boasted of them. But this was something else. Here, war was not only necessity. It was spectacle, devotion, almost theatre. Children clambered onto steps for a better view. Women carried jugs of water to those preparing. The air itself seemed to tighten, charged like the moment before lightning strikes. The stranger edged closer, heart hammering, unable to look away. A priest stood upon the platform, his feathered cloak blazing in the sunlight, his voice rising above the drums. Though the words were foreign, the intent was unmistakable. This was blessing and command, ritual and rallying cry. Warriors stamped their feet in unison, the sound rolling through the square like thunder. It was intoxicating, terrifying. The stranger felt their chests tighten as though caught in the rhythm. To stand among them was to feel small, powerless, yet also swept up in the certainty that this gathering, this readiness for battle, was the pulse of the empire itself. Then came the weapons. Spears tipped with obsidian that glittered like shards of night. Macuital. Wooden blades lined with sharp volcanic glass that could slice as cleanly as steel. Shields painted with suns and serpents. The stranger had thought of obsidian as something for mirrors or jewelry, but here it was honed into death. They imagined the weight of one of those weapons in their own hands, the swing, the spray of blood. A shiver ran down their spine, and yet, in the crowd, there was no fear. Faces glowed with pride, with expectation. Mothers smiled at sons preparing to march. Boys stared wide-eyed at warriors they might one day become. War here was not a distant horror. It was woven into daily life, into identity itself. To fight was to feed the gods, to keep the sun rising, to hold the world steady. The drums shifted again, quickening. A line of captives was led into the square, their arms bound, their faces marked with resignation. Some looked young, barely older than boys. Others stared with hardened eyes. The crowd murmured, but without pity. These men were not victims, they were offerings. The stranger's stomach knotted. It was one thing to see the tools of war, it was another to see the human cost, flesh and bone and breath standing so close. The captives were not killed here, not yet. They were paraded, shown, reminders of what war meant and what it brought. Children craned their necks to see them, men nodded approvingly, women whispered prayers. The stranger turned away, their throat tight, and still the city pulsed on, alive, unshaken. This was Tenochtitlan, a place where beauty and brutality were bound so tightly together that one could not be pulled free from the other. The stranger realized, with a cold clarity, that to live here was to accept both, to cheer the warrior and to bless the sacrifice, to dance in the market, and to watch blood spill on stone. The drums slowed once more, steady, final. The warriors stood tall, their painted faces catching the light. The priest's voice dropped, and the crowd exhaled. The ritual was done, the blessing complete. War would come soon, but for now the city breathed again. The stranger lingered, marigolds still pressed between their fingers, its petals beginning to wilt. They looked around, the square, the warriors, the crowd, and felt the weight of it all. They were lost here, yes, but perhaps not by accident. Perhaps the city wanted them lost, wanted them to see every face it wore, the laughter, the markets, the blood, the music, the drums. And yet, even in that realization, something stirred. If this was the heart of the empire, then what secrets waited at its edges? What shadows pressed in from beyond the lake, beyond the mountains? Tenochtitlan was vast, but it was not the whole world. Somewhere out there, other storms were gathering, ones that even this mighty city might not withstand. For now, though, the stranger stayed, bound by the rhythm of the drums, by the smell of smoke and maize, by the haunting beauty of a city that glittered like a jewel on the water and burned like fire beneath the sun. The city shimmered under the late afternoon sun, its canals blazing with reflected light, its temples rising like stone giants against the horizon. The stranger stood on a causeway, staring out at Tenochtitlan, and for the first time since arriving, a strange heaviness pressed into their chest. It wasn't simply awe anymore. It was something closer to grief. For days, perhaps weeks, though time had blurred, they had wandered through this floating jewel. They had breathed its incense and its smoke, eaten its maize and chilies, touched its stones still warm from the sun. They had seen the laughter of children and the sharp cruelty of ritual, the glimmer of gold feathers and the dull glaze of captive eyes. They had walked the markets where abundance spilled in heaps, and they had smelled the altars where blood still stained the stones. Tenochtitlan was not one thing, it was everything, all at once. And that was the weight now, the realization that no city could hold so much brilliance without also holding its shadow. It was impossible not to wonder how long such a fragile balance could last. The stranger thought of the drums that seemed to echo every hour, keeping time not only for rituals but for the heartbeat of an empire. And they wondered what happens when the drums stop. That thought carried them into the city once more, their feet moving with no clear purpose, only the desire to see it all again before it slipped away. The streets bustled with their endless energy, vendors shouting, women laughing as they haggled, priests walking with solemn dignity. A dog nosed through a pile of discarded maize husks. A boy darted after it, only to trip and sprawl into the dust, laughing at his own clumsiness. Ordinary life, so normal it almost erased the visions of sacrifice and war. Almost. The stranger stopped at a small shrine, tucked into the corner of a square. Candles flickered, their wax pooling into tiny rivers. Offerings lay neatly arranged, flowers, beads, maize kernels, a small carved figure. No great temple, no grand spectacle, just a quiet place where someone had placed their hopes. The stranger lingered, touched by the intimacy. For all its grandeur, Tenochtitlan was made of these moments too. The scent of roasted cacao beans pulled them on, past women grinding them into paste, past a man pouring the dark, foaming drink into a clay cup. They imagined its bitterness, its energy, the way it must have fueled countless mornings in this city. A reminder that history is not only made in temples or on battlefields, but in kitchens and markets, in sips and bites, shared between neighbors. Yet even as they walked, unease prickled. The stranger could not shake the sense that something loomed on the horizon, unseen but inevitable. It was not just the city's own shadows, the sacrifices, the war captives. It was something larger pressing in. They thought of the obsidian mirror they had seen in the market, how it seemed to gaze back at them, and they wondered if the city itself knew. They wandered back to the great plaza, where the temples dominated the skyline. The air was thick with incense, the stones thrumming with the memory of rituals past. Crowds gathered in clusters, waiting, whispering. High above, priests moved like small figures against the vast backdrop of the temple steps. The stranger watched in silence, and for the first time, they did not recoil. They only observed, heavy with understanding. The rituals were not cruelty for cruelty's sake. They were belief made flesh, devotion carved into stone and skin. This city thrived because its people believed it must. And yet, belief was both strength and vulnerability. If the stranger had learned anything in these streets, it was that nothing, no matter how dazzling, lasted forever. The sun dipped lower, gilding the temples in orange fire. The stranger walked one last time to the edge of the lake. The waters stretched endlessly, reflecting the city's brilliance. Canoes glided softly, their ripples breaking the reflection into fragments. It struck the stranger then this was how history worked. Whole worlds, glittering and immense, reduced to ripples and shards once disturbed. They knelt at the water's edge, cupping it in their hands. The lake was cool, alive, tasting faintly of earth. They let it slip back through their fingers, watching it vanish as though it had never been. Just like moments, just like empires. Behind them, the drums pulsed again, steady, insistent. Life continued. The city breathed. Children ran, warriors trained, priests prayed. Tenochtitlan did not know what was coming, not yet. It only knew itself magnificent, terrible, breathtaking. The stranger rose slowly, taking in the sight one final time. They would carry this city with them always. The smell of copal, the taste of maize, the gleam of obsidian, the laughter in the markets, the shadows on the temple steps. They would carry its contradictions, its beauty, its dread. To be lost in Tenochtitlan was not to lose oneself, but to be claimed by something larger, something that would linger forever in memory. And as the last light of day blurred into twilight, the stranger turned away from the lake, from the glittering jewel city, with the quiet certainty that they had witnessed something that could never truly be forgotten, even long after the drums were silenced. The city shone on, its reflection trembling across the water, alive in its final glory.